I'm joined today by Bill Goldsmith, who's Professor Emeritus of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University and also the author of Saving Our Cities, a progressive plan to transform urban America. Bill, it's so great to talk to you. And, during the presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, we saw cities and urban centers referred to in a lot of different ways. It was highly racialized, in particular, the way that Donald Trump referred to big cities and urban areas. And there was also a lot of discussion around cities with relation to poverty. So let's first take the broadest step back that we can. When did discussion of cities become this racialized?
Ah, good question. Actually, a great question. So let me break it into two parts. When did the discussion become racialized? But maybe before that, when did cities become so remarkably racialized? If we go back 40 or 50 or even 60 years to the post-World War II era, we discover that during the vast suburbanization that created our metropolitan areas, federal policy actually legally, officially, uh, in effect prohibited the mixing of races in areas that received federal housing subsidies, bank loan guarantees through the Federal Housing Administration. This was uniformly true throughout the United States. It was prohibited finally by the Supreme Court in the 1950s, and it also influenced totally housing policy for public housing. So it was for private suburban development and public housing policy. Private suburban development was restricted almost entirely to white populations, and housing policy located Black and poor and Latino and other minority populations, Chinese in San Francisco, for example, in specific housing projects restricted to them alone. So federal and local policy really dictated sharp segregation of races in the United States. Then, during the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies, with lots and lots of urban program, there were attempts to break this down, but they succeeded very little against massive white flight. So what we get by the time we enter the election process this year is a country that's just deeply divided between essentially dark-skinned cities and poor cities, cities with poor inhabitants, despite spikes of tremendous wealth in places like Manhattan or central Seattle or Portland or San Francisco, and suburbs that are largely white and middle class. Now, it's true that by now a majority of poor people by census standards, live in what we call suburbs, that is, areas outside what some call the white noose that strangles cities. But those are also often known as cities or urban areas in our language, and they're deprived. So they have inferior schools, inferior public services, lower tax incomes, even though they have very high tax rates. So this sort of stratification gets to be recognized as Trump, I think, quite vulgarly refers to all Black people as though they're all poor, even though very large numbers are middle class and live in middle class suburbs.
And along those lines, Bill, because you touched on something which was sort of going to be what I wanted to get into next. There's this assumption often that cities are the root of many of society's problems in terms of being associated with very high crime rates and drug issues, etc. Can you talk to us a little bit about how we should really think about that? And one thing that seems missing to me from that conversation is, by their very nature, when you have higher concentrations of people, you are going to have dynamics that are different than in rural and suburban areas. And I don't feel like that's often accounted for when cities are just criticized.
Yeah, well, you're right, and you've seen what I've written, so you know I agree. So there's a couple of issues here. First of all, it's not at all clear that city crime rates are higher than rural crime rates, and it is absolutely untrue that rates of drug use in cities are higher than rates of drug use in either suburbs or small towns or rural areas. There is simply no evidence whatsoever, and there are massive surveys undertaken every year by good, solid statistical agencies, University of Michigan Survey Research Center, for example, working for the Drug Enforcement Agency and the Census and so forth, that show that drug use rates are pretty uniform across racial groups. They're somewhat lower among Asians, they're somewhat higher among Native American Indians, but the two, three big groups that are always examined, blacks, whites, Hispanics, or Latinos, the drug, alcohol, tobacco uses vary up and down a little bit across these groups, but not very much. Similarly, they don't vary much by location. What does vary is where police can find, as you suggest here, relatively dense concentrations of people where it's much easier to make large numbers of arrests, or for that matter, it may be easier to find locations where drugs are sold. But of course, when they're sold by city residents to people who come in from the suburbs to buy them. I mean, that's where the money is. The big money is, of course, in selling drugs to people who have lots of money. And that's predominantly in the United States, whites. So the drug problem is principally a white problem. The drug war, though, which does, as all evidence suggests, nothing whatsoever to reduce either drug sales or drug use, prosecutes people who happen to live in poor neighborhoods of central cities. The reasons for that are very complex. They have to do with ideology, with racism, with this sort of theme that drug problems are always someone else's problems, unlike alcohol problems, where everybody has an Uncle Louie who's an alcoholic and is a problem at family gatherings and weddings and so forth. And we sort of treat them as though it's a behavioral problem, a mental problem, something to be tolerated but controlled. Whereas with minority drug use, we say these are criminals, they're thugs, they're people ruining our world. It's simply not true, but it's been worked into our ideology so thoroughly. This begins a long, long time ago with Asian exclusion laws, with the assumption that drug abuse in cities was something brought in by the Chinese, and then attempts to export Mexicans very early on, who are accused of bringing marijuana into the country. I'm talking about 40, 50 years ago, even longer. And then, of course, the blame entirely that the whole drug problem is a problem of ghettos in American cities, when it isn't at all. The problem is that the drug war creates tremendous violence, reduces opportunities, removes potentially productive men from their homes, and imprisons them in what is now widely recognized as insanely large numbers of people who haven't committed violent crimes, but go to prison and learn how to commit violent crimes. I'm myself involved in a prison education program that a group of Cornell professors started running in the 1990s, when the Congress and President Clinton cut funding for college scholarships, Pell Grants to prisons, 1993. They just jumped in to begin teaching in prisons, and the results have been absolutely phenomenal. We now work in 4 upstate New York bad news prisons, where prisoners are just dying to get in and come to class, study hard, that people who teach in the prison simply love teaching there because the prisoners are so responsive and study so hard. It's true they don't have a lot else to do, but it just changes the tone, sometimes in the entire prison. So I'm combining all of this, putting the drug war, the prison expansion, the enormous profits by private corporations that supply prisons, the huge influx of sort of war-fighting material into police departments, all the fancy equipment and vehicles they have, the new kinds of crowd dispersal bombs, these flash bombs,
Yeah,
the
and Bill, in
use.
the interest of, because we just have a limited time and there were so many
Yeah.
things I wanted to get to, and I'll have to sort of pick and choose what we'll have time for. You started to get into the economic aspect of this. In the book, you actually talk more about the importance of inequality in cities than just poverty itself. And inequality, of course, more of a relative measure than poverty. Make that case. Why is inequality something that we should be looking closely at in relation to poverty?
Well, that's actually a great question. I'm remembering that in 1930, Justice Brandeis said we can have democracy or we can have inequality, but we can't have both. Those aren't his exact words, but it's very close.
Hmm.
In the last 20 years, as we all know, because of the Wall Street 1% protests, we have funded through our tax policies and our expenditure policies a tiny minority, 1/10 of 1% of the population, maybe, and very, very giant corporations who have just walked away with all of the productivity gains of the last 20 or 30 years. And they've taken money away from just those people who I suspect in large numbers voted for Donald Trump yesterday. That inequality comes on top of the poverty for people at the bottom. They're not directly related, but they're very closely related. I think the inequality in our cities, which shows up in the statistics, but it's inequality nationally as well, drives politics that leads us to ignore the needs of the bulk of the population. This is the sort of lower ends of the working class and those who don't vote at all, who are lots of very poor people all over the country, and they're predominantly concentrated in cities. The if you look at the numbers, something like 80% of the U.S. population lives in metropolitan areas with populations larger than 200,000 people.
Right.
So this claim that everybody's out in the rural areas just isn't true. Large majorities of Americans live either in cities or in the suburbs immediately surrounding cities. They may have been small towns before, but they're really urbanized now. So this inequality leads us to ignore the needs of large numbers of our population and make things okay for those of us who are lucky enough to have good incomes, and really okay for that tiny group of people who have enormously high incomes. And it's pretty clear to me that that's a major piece of what's driving our sort of insane politics today.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. We've been speaking about the book Saving Our Cities, a progressive plan to transform urban America, will be very important over the next 4 years under President-elect Trump. We've been speaking with the book's author, Bill Goldsmith. Thanks so much for talking to us about this.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to you.